Growing up, I always knew my place in my family, though I never asked for it. From the moment we were children, my older sister Amna was celebrated as the shining star. She was the one with straight A's, polished manners, and a natural charm that made adults adore her. Every time we visited relatives, my parents boasted about her grades, her talent for debate, and later her prestigious university admissions. If Amna walked into a room, everyone seemed to notice. If I walked in, I often felt like a shadow trailing behind Dot. It wasn't as if I didn't try. I worked hard in school, but I wasn't a natural academic star like Amna, where she excelled in mathematics and science. I leaned more toward creativity writing, small community projects, things that didn't impress my parents. When I got decent grades, they were brushed off as bare minimum. When Amna succeeded, the entire household lit up like it was a festival. By the time I was a teenager, I had already accepted that no matter what I did, I would always be the lesser child that unspoken hierarchy carried into adulthood. Amna went on to get a high-paying corporate job, married a wealthy man, and lived in a luxurious home. Every step she took seemed to elevate her status in our parents' eyes. Meanwhile, I chose a quieter path. I took on jobs that didn't make me rich but gave me satisfaction. I wasn't driving luxury cars or wearing designer clothes, but I paid my own bills and built a modest, independent life. That should have been enough, but to my parents, independence meant nothing without prestige. Conversations at family dinners always followed the same script. My parents asked Amna about her latest promotion, her travels, or her husband's investments. They turned to me only to throw in remarks like, "So, are you still at that little job of yours? Or maybe one day you'll be like your sister." It was never a question, always a jab cloaked in fake concern. The worst part was the casualness of it all. They didn't see their words as cruel. To them it was just truth. In their minds, Amna was proof of their successful parenting, while I was the example of what happens when a child doesn't live up to their standards. My efforts, struggles, and small victories never seemed to matter. Even when I paid off a debt or got recognition at work, they would dismiss it with, "That's nice, but look at what Amna just achieved." Over time, I stopped sharing things about my life. Why bother when I knew the reaction? It was easier to nod, smile, and let them compare me unfavorably to my sister. But each comparison chipped away at my confidence. I found myself questioning if maybe they were right, if maybe I really was the failure they implied I was. What stung most was that Amna never missed a chance to rub it in. She had this subtle way of reminding me that she had made it, while I hadn't. At first, I thought it was unintentional arrogance, but I soon realized it was deliberate. When she mentioned her annual bonuses or expensive vacations, her eyes always flicked toward me, waiting to see my reaction. And if I stayed quiet, she would add, "Don't worry, you'll get there one day." Hopefully. The imbalance was so deeply ingrained that it became the natural rhythm of our family dynamic. Amna, the golden daughter. Me, the constant disappointment. My parents' voices carried that tone of pride for her and thinly veiled disappointment for me. It wasn't a passing phase, it was the story of my life. What I didn't know, however, was that this story was about to take an unexpected turn. For the first time in years, someone I never expected, would step in and challenge the narrative my parents had built around me. It was during one of those all too familiar family gatherings that everything came to a head. My parents had invited me to dinner at Amna's house, a sprawling, modern villa her husband had bought in an upscale neighborhood. I almost didn't want to go because I knew how these dinners usually played out. But refusing an invitation would only give my parents more ammunition. "See, you're so bitter you can't even be around your sister." So I went, reminding myself to smile, nod, and keep the peace. The moment I stepped in, I could already feel the divide. Amna greeted me with her usual bright smile, but there was something smug behind it. She looked me up and down before commenting lightly, "Oh, you didn't dress up? That's okay. You've always been more simple." I laughed it off, though inside the sting was immediate. My parents didn't miss the remark either, and I caught my mother exchanging a knowing smile with Amna. Dinner began the way it always did, a showcase of Amna's achievements. She spoke animatedly about a new project she was leading at work, about the luxury brand collaboration her company had landed, and about her upcoming trip to Europe. My parents hung on every word, nodding, praising, and adding their own embellishments. And you know, my father said, beaming proudly, when Amna sets her mind on something, she makes it happen. That's what success looks like. Then, as if on cue, all eyes turned to me. My mother asked casually, "So, what are you doing these days?" Her tone wasn't curious, it was performative. Like she already knew the answer would disappoint her. I cleared my throat and explained a bit about my work. How I'd been managing projects for a small nonprofit, and how we had just completed a successful community initiative. Before I could even finish, Amna leaned forward with that sweet, cutting voice of hers. "A nonprofit? That's, cute. But don't you ever feel like you're selling yourself short? I mean, you're not in your 20s anymore. Shouldn't you think about something more stable, something that actually pays well?" My parents laughed. Actually laughed. My father chuckled and added, "She's right. Passion is good, but at some point you have to be realistic. Look at your sister, she worked hard and now she's reaping the rewards. You should take notes." Something inside me snapped then. I had swallowed their jabs for years, convincing myself it was easier to stay quiet than to defend myself. But that night, the weight of their laughter pressed down harder than ever before. My chest tightened, my face flushed, and my hands trembled under the table. I forced a smile, but my voice cracked as I said, "You know, I'm actually proud of the work I do. It may not pay as much as Amna's job, but it makes a difference. Isn't that worth something?" The room fell silent for a moment, but then Amna smirked and shrugged. "Sure, if you want to spend your life in mediocrity, but don't expect applause for it." My parents chuckled again, as though she had just made the cleverest joke. In that instant, I felt completely alone, surrounded by my own family, yet treated like an outsider. Humiliation burned in my throat. I wanted to leave, to walk out and never look back, but I stayed frozen, staring at the table, biting back tears. That was the breaking point. That was the moment I realized it wasn't just harmless teasing. It was contempt, pure and simple. And for the first time in my life, someone I least expected, noticed it too. Sitting quietly at the head of the table, Amna's husband had watched the entire exchange without saying a word. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes had darkened. While everyone else laughed at my expense, he didn't, and though I didn't know it then, he was about to do something that would flip the entire script of our family dynamic. As the laughter from my sister's jab faded, an awkward silence stretched across the table. I kept my eyes fixed on the plate in front of me, stabbing at the untouched food, wishing the evening would end. My parents had already moved on, still smiling and basking in Amna's glow. But there was one person who hadn't joined, and the one person I least expected to notice, Amna's husband. Saad sat at the head of the table, his fork resting on the edge of his plate. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't even smiling. Instead, his expression was thoughtful, his gaze flicking from Amna to my parents, and finally landing on me. For the first time, I felt the weight of his attention, not as a background presence, but as if he was actually seeing me. Saad was the kind of man my parents adored. Wealthy, polished, and successful, he was everything they thought mattered in life. Since marrying Amna, he had been a quiet figure at family gatherings, present but not loud, polite but not particularly involved. He always seemed more focused on his phone or on keeping Amna happy than on whatever family drama was unfolding. I had gotten the impression that he didn't care much about the subtle digs or comparisons. To him, I assumed I was just Amna's less accomplished sibling, irrelevant to his world, but that night, I noticed something different. While Amna boasted and my parents cheered, Saad's expression barely shifted. His eyes were sharp, observing, almost calculating. Every time Amna's words cut into me, I felt his gaze linger, like he was testing the weight of the cruelty in the room. When my parents laughed at my expense, I caught him lean back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He didn't say anything then, but the silence around him grew heavy, almost deliberate. It was as though he was holding himself back, choosing carefully whether or not to step into the battlefield of my family's dynamic. I wasn't used to anyone noticing my humiliation. For years, it had been the same routine. My parents sided with Amna, relatives nodded along, and I swallowed the bitterness. Nobody ever interrupted. Nobody ever defended me. Why would they? To them, it was harmless teasing or tough love, but Saad's silence wasn't indifferent. It was loaded. I remember sneaking a glance at him as Amna launched into another monologue about her latest purchase, a designer handbag that apparently cost more than my monthly salary. She spoke loudly, her words dripping with superiority, and my parents nodded as though she had accomplished something monumental. Saad didn't join in. Instead, he set his glass down slowly and glanced at me. Just a flicker of a look, but it was enough to make me realize something unusual. He wasn't laughing because he didn't find any of it amusing. The realization startled me. For years, I thought nobody cared enough to see what I went through. Yet here was the one person I had written off as another silent participant, sitting quietly but clearly registering the unfairness. It wasn't just about kindness. Saad was a man who valued control and respect. I could see that much in how he carried himself. And from the tight set of his jaw, I could tell he didn't appreciate the arrogance or the cruelty being thrown around so casually at his table for the rest of the meal. His silence was louder than any words. Amna kept talking, my parents kept laughing, but Saad, he was waiting, watching, letting the weight of the moment settle. And somewhere deep down, I felt it, that shift in the air, that almost imperceptible promise that things weren't going to continue the way they always had. For the first time in years, I sensed an ally. Someone who might not let the insults slide this time. I just didn't know yet that Saad's patience had limits, and once he reached them, the consequences for my family would be unforgettable. The evening dragged on, each word from Amna landing heavier than the last. She was in her element, performing for my parents as though she were on stage. Every story she told about her job, her purchases, her lifestyle was laced with the same subtle poison, little digs meant to remind me of my place. At one point, she leaned across the table and asked me, "So, do you even save anything from your paycheck? Or is it all just enough to get by?" She smiled sweetly, but the words carried venom. My parents chuckled like it was the funniest thing in the world. That's when I noticed Saad put down his fork. It was a small movement, but it cut through the laughter like a blade. His posture changed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table, and the room's energy shifted. "Amna," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "Enough." The laughter died instantly. My mother froze mid-smile, my father stopped chewing, and even Amna blinked in confusion. Saad rarely raised his voice, but there was something in his tone that commanded attention. What do you mean?" Amna asked, her laugh awkward now. "I was just joking." Saad's eyes were steady on her. "No, you weren't. You've been mocking your sister all evening. And your parents have been encouraging it." The silence was deafening. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly not expecting him to turn the spotlight on them. Saad didn't stop there. His words were precise, sharp, like someone who had been observing long enough and had finally decided to intervene. "I've watched this pattern for years. Every time we gather, it's the same. Amna ghosts you too." He looked directly at my parents. "Cheer her on, and then you all take turns belittling her sister. Do you realize how cruel that is?" My father cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "It's not cruelty. We're just encouraging her to do better. She needs to see the difference between success and failure." "Failure?" Saad cut in smoothly, his tone cold. "Is that what you call someone who stands on their own feet, pays their own bills, and works with integrity? That sounds like success to me. Maybe not the flashy kind you like to brag about at parties, but the kind that actually matters." I sat frozen, my heart pounding. No one had ever spoken to my parents like this, least of all Saad, the man they idolized for his wealth. Amna's face flushed red. "Saad, I don't think you understand. I was only trying to motivate her by tearing her down." His voice sharpened, and for the first time there was steel behind it. You call it motivation, but what I see is arrogance. You measure worth by salaries and brands. Do you even realize how shallow that is? My mother's lips parted in shock. My father shifted uncomfortably, but neither dared interrupt again. Saad's words carried too much authority, too much truth. Then he turned to me. His gaze softened just slightly. I see someone who chose a path she believes in, even if it doesn't impress anyone at this table. That takes courage. More courage than hiding behind money or titles. My throat tightened. For years I had begged silently for even a sliver of validation from my family. To hear it from Sada of all people was overwhelming. When he leaned back again, the room was still. My parents avoided his eyes. Amna fidgeted in her seat, her usual confidence shattered. And I sat there, stunned as it sank in. Someone had finally stood up for me. Someone had finally dared to put my family in their place, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that followed Saad's words felt heavier than anything I'd ever experienced in that house. It was the kind of silence that exposes every hidden crack, every unspoken truth, and forces people to sit with it. My parents, who had always been quick with their laughter and quicker with their criticism, suddenly looked small. My father was the first to move, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He tried to muster the confidence he always wore when talking down to me, but his voice cracked with hesitation. Saad, you're misunderstanding. We only want the best for our daughter. We don't mean to belittle her, it's just guidance. Saad tilted his head slightly, his expression unyielding. Guidance? Mocking someone for their career, their income, their choices, that's not guidance. That's humiliation. You've been doing it for so long that you don't even see the cruelty anymore. You call it encouragement, but all I hear is disrespect. My mother bristled, her pride flaring. We raised our children to aim high. Is it wrong to expect more from her? Saad's eyes flicked to her, steady and sharp. No, but it is wrong to strip her of dignity because her success doesn't look like Amna's. You measure everything in money, titles and appearances. Do you ever stop to ask if she's happy? Or if she's proud of what she does? Because I can tell you this, she should be. The words landed like thunder. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue further. She couldn't single quotes to Amna, however, wasn't ready to give up her crown. She crossed her arms, her voice dripping with disbelief. So now she's the saint? Come on, Saad, you're exaggerating. She's barely holding things together. We both know I've accomplished more. Why pretend otherwise? The air grew colder. Saad turned to her, his gaze hard enough to make her falter. Accomplished more? Amna, you've done well in your career, yes. But you confuse privilege with superiority. You had opportunities others didn't. Your sister didn't take the easy road you did. And instead of respecting her independence, you mock it to inflate your own ego. That's not accomplishment, that's insecurity. Amna's mouth opened, then closed again. For once, she had no quick retort, no clever jab. She looked at him as though he had betrayed her, her cheeks burning. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to being confronted like this, especially not by the man they admired most. To them, Saad was the epitome of success, the proof of everything they valued. And now, that very man was dismantling their values piece by piece, exposing how shallow and cruel they had been. My father tried again, his tone softer, almost pleading. Saad, maybe we've been too harsh at times. But you know how parents are, we want both our children to succeed. Saad's response was swift. If that's the case, then show it. Stop tearing one down to glorify the other. Success isn't a competition, and it certainly isn't measured by who owns the bigger house or the fancier car. If you can't see that, then you're failing as parents, not her as a daughter. The words hung heavy, undeniable. I sat in stunned silence, my emotions a storm. For so long I had carried the weight of being the failure, the one who never measured up. And now, here was the man my parents respected above all others, telling them without hesitation that they were wrong, that I wasn't the disappointment, that maybe, just maybe, they were. My mother's eyes darted toward me then, as if seeing me for the first time in years. There was no warmth, but there was uncertainty, hesitation where once there had only been contempt. My father avoided my gaze altogether, his authority stripped bare, and Amna. She stared down at her plate, lips pressed tight, her usual smirk gone. The balance had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being put in my place. The room didn't feel like Amna's glamorous dining room anymore. The marble table, the expensive chandelier, the polished silverware, all of it faded into the background. What remained was the tension, raw, heavy, unshakable. My parents, usually so full of authority and certainty, looked unsettled. Amna, usually armed with her arsenal of jabs and smirks, sat silent, her lips pressed together, eyes cast downward. And Sad had become the voice none of us ever expected to hear. I sat frozen, trying to steady my breath. For years I had been invisible, the easy target, the punchline to jokes dressed up as advice. But tonight, someone had not only seen me, they had defended me with a clarity and strength that I had never been able to muster for myself. And that someone wasn't just anyone. It was Saad, the man my parents respected, admired, and in many ways idolized. His words carried a weight mine never could in their eyes. It was surreal, watching my parents shrink under the very authority they once worshipped. My father fiddled with his napkin, avoiding eye contact. My mother's fingers tapped against her glass, betraying her nerves. Their silence spoke louder than their words ever had. Finally, my mother tried to recover, her voice cautious. Well, perhaps we've been too harsh sometimes. Maybe we didn't realize how it sounded. She glanced at me quickly, but it wasn't an apology, it was damage control. Sad didn't let her off the hook. Then realize it now. Respect isn't optional, especially not for your own child. Amna shifted uncomfortably, her pride clearly stung. She muttered, "You didn't have to embarrass us like this." Saad turned to her, his voice calm but unyielding. "No, Amna, what's embarrassing is how you've treated your sister. You wanted to make her small in front of everyone. Tonight I won't allow it." Her face tightened, but she didn't argue. She knew she couldn't not with him. For me, though, the moment was overwhelming. My throat burned, my chest ached, and for a terrifying second I thought I might cry right there at the table. Not because I was weak, but because I had carried this burden for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be defended. I forced myself to sit straighter, to lift my chin, to breathe through the storm of emotions, and then, for the first time in years, I allowed myself to look at my parents directly. They didn't look powerful anymore. They didn't look like the final judges of my worth. They just looked human, flawed, and suddenly I realized something vital. Their approval had never defined me. Their cruelty had never been the truth. It had only been noise I had let drown out my own voice. That realization was liberating. The rest of the evening limped along, but the sparkle was gone. My parents barely spoke. Amna kept her head down, and Saad remained calm, eating quietly as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. When it was finally time to leave, I stood up with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. My parents mumbled polite goodbyes, their eyes avoiding mine. Amna hugged me stiffly, her usual confidence cracked. And Saadi simply gave me a nod, subtle but meaningful, like he was silently saying, "Don't forget this moment. Don't shrink back again." Walking out of that house, I felt lighter than I had in years. For once, I wasn't replaying their words in my head, wondering if maybe they were right about me. Instead, I replayed Saad's voice, calm, steady, unshakable, cutting through years of cruelty with a single truth. I was not the failure they made me out to be. That night, I realized I no longer needed their approval. I had survived without it, and I would continue to thrive without it. Their words, their comparisons, their laughter, it all meant nothing now, because someone had finally exposed the lie I had lived under for so long, and in the silence that followed, I finally heard the truth of my own worth.